guys, welcome to another Tuesday night podcast. Tonight we are broadcasting live, and it's everything real estate auctions. You've probably, heard about a real estate auction from somebody that you know. If you're a real estate investor, you've probably gone to many of them in your time. Whether you have a good feeling about it or bad feeling about it, tonight we have Chuck Billig of A.J. Billig Auctioneers. And guys, this guy's the pro. I mean, if you're in the Baltimore area, you know who they are. We're going to learn so much tonight. What are the types of auctions that you can go to? I mean, there's short sales, there's foreclosures, bank auctions, estate sales, you name it. Anybody could really have a real estate auction, but some auctions are more, prevalent than others. And, as a real estate investor myself, I've been to quite a few auctions, but I got to tell you, I haven't bought a whole lot at auctions. And some auctioneers say that they can get, or they're proud to say they can get 125% more, 125% of retail, or what somebody like me would prefer to pay. And a lot of times I just back off. Well, Chuck's going to tell us some secrets tonight. And guys, we appreciate you being on our show with us. So no matter where you are in the country or the world, really, I mean, with the internet, hopefully you're going to learn some good information tonight. And it is a live show. So if you'd like, go ahead and comment your questions, and we'll be sure to get the answers that you're looking for. Guys, I'm Todd Sachs. I'm a real estate broker here in Maryland. We do residential and commercial transactions. But if you're anywhere in the country and you don't have an agent, I'd love to help you. Just reach out. I will point you in the right direction. I have an amazing broker network all over the country. And guys, while you're watching this video, if you like it, go ahead and hit that thumbs up. It will let us know we're doing a good job. It will also make sure that you get more great content just like this wherever you're watching. So without further ado, I'd like to go ahead and introduce Chuck. Chuck, thank you so much for being with me tonight. And go ahead and introduce yourself.
Todd, it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for you and your team inviting me. I'm Chuck Billig with A.J. Billig & Company Auctioneers. We're a family-held auction firm in our 103rd year of business. I'm a fourth-generation auctioneer, handling all sorts of different real estate, residential, commercial, multifamily, land, and everything in between. So thanks again for having me.
Yeah, so we want to dive in and talk about the strategies. So I know you as an auctioneer, you have a strategy, right? It's to bring that seller as much money as possible, right? So, kind of explain that strategy from your standpoint when you get started with your auction chant.
In and out, Todd. So am I doing the chant now? Is that what we're doing?
Yeah, well, hey, look, if you want to chant, brother, go ahead. We'd love to hear it. You want to chant?
Just a little bit. I got 10 now, 15, bid the 15, going to 15. How do we hear at 20? You bidding 20. I see Todd at 20. Who's at 25? I got 25 in the back now, 30. 30, 35, 40, 45, 50, 50, and now 60. And
Easy
we don't go that fast because we're selling real estate. I'm not selling cattle. So
that's
we
right,
don't have that many sales in a day.
I thought you were talking about $35 or something, man. That's like my watch, my old Timex or something.
Yeah, more like thousands, 10,000s in the equivalent. But either way, I'll take what bids come in.
Yeah. So, obviously you want to try and get people the most amount of money. What are you thinking when you start that? I mean, what's your objective? To try and get this thing over with as quick as possible, stretch it out? Just tell everybody what you're thinking.
Well, I mean, the process really starts with analyzing the product. Some products are better geared towards auction than others. So as an example, if we have something residential in, a condition that makes sense for both home buyers to do their own renovations or fix and flip investors, that tends to be a good product for us. And so part of that is going to be having an initial discussion with the sellers about A, pricing, B, marketing plan, and some other strategies that go along with that. With pricing, there's lots of different ways to price a property. You can do it with a confidential reserve price, meaning the buyers don't know what that price is. You can do it with a disclosed minimum price, meaning they do. An absolute auction, at least the true absolute auction, is no reserve, no minimum. So each of those has an impact that may be more valuable for that seller and that product type. With the auction itself, there's a lot of different considerations, and the marketplace is a lot different now than when I started 15 years ago, so that you have online bidding, as a potential aspect of that. You have simulcast bidding, which involves both online and in-person bidding, or you have true live-only auctions. Again, there are different thought processes with how long you may want the auction to draw out. Again, whether that's a couple of days of online bidding leading up to a simulcast sale, or you just have, a quick 5-minute in-person auction where you make the announcements, draw as many bids as you can, and knock it down to the highest bidder.
So is there psychology that you're working off of? It's, the auctions that I've been to, it's like soon as the bidding starts and you're a bidder, you can just feel your heart starting to beat, faster. And you at this point you're trying to look at, the players that are there. So is there a psychology that is causing people to outbid one another? I mean, is there something that that, being in the trade that you're trying to do? Maybe you're looking at them a certain way, or you're prompting that bidder to bid more?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of different things going on as far as what the buyer psychology may be. You have a few different considerations. Number one, I think there's a supposition by a lot of buyers that everybody's perspective is the same as theirs. And so if you see somebody who's willing to pay 10 or 20 or 30% more than you are, the snap reaction is that person is foolish. You really don't know what their situation is. They may be able to do the renovation more cost effectively than you. They may be looking at the property to live in themselves or as a rental, and you as an investor are only looking at it at fix and flip. So I think the analysis isn't the same across each and every buyer situation. As far as, that vibe that you're getting to, that energy, that ramp up, some people have it and some people don't. We certainly have lots of buyers who are very analytical. They have spreadsheet numbers and they're going to work up to their number, and that's it. In some cases, those guys don't even bid unless it stalls at a number that works for them. They don't want to tip their hand to the other investors. Other people come hot right out of the gate, and I have certainly participated at auctions myself, not held by us, and as an example on that, a lot of the buyers were home buyers, if not all of them, and they were hyped up and nervous about it. And so my strategy was to jump the bid right out of the gate. It had a starting bid of, I think, 300 or 350. It was a property that was probably worth about 600. And I came out of the gate at 500, and half of the buyer pool left. They weren't going to wait to see what happened. It was a deal that made sense to them at some number less than that. So I had winnowed out, 4 of the 8 people there right at the beginning. And so, if I'm giving instruction to buyers about managing that energy level, the best answer I can give is be prepared. Just do your work, do your analysis, get proposals for renovation budgets, figure out what your financing looks like, what you want your margins to be, or what you're willing to be into it for. As a home buyer, work up to that number and stop. It shouldn't have to be emotional for the buyer. It's a numbers game, but, believe me, I don't mind when people get carried away. If they have all the information that we've provided and we try to do a good job doing that, then have at it. I don't need to be right about the pricing. You get to be right about the pricing.
Most of the auctions that I've been to, people are getting carried away. I mean, it's just, I try and rationalize. I've been in the business for a long time, so when I'm looking at what some of these buyers are paying, and again, you don't know the strategy. I was actually at a courthouse auction one time, and I was talking with one of the guys before the auction started. It was a foreclosure auction, and the guy said, I'm going to pay whatever I have to pay. This is, my family's house. And I'm prepared to write a check. So basically, you guys can bid whatever you want. You're getting beat. And sure enough, he won the bid. I mean, he just kept taking it up. But when is it appropriate for people to use an auction to sell their house?
Sure. So again, I'd indicated before the right product, right situation. And so when we're analyzing, a seller's property, there's a few different things that we're looking at. Natural to those are the same things that you would be looking at as a traditional broker, being what is the condition? What are the comps? How is the location response wise? Is it, a high volume, high demand location, or is it a low volume, low demand location? So all those are going to factor in, but we're also looking at some things that may be less pertinent for traditional listing agents, which is what type of financing are the buyers getting? So the auction itself has cash requirements and a reduced contingency capacity than a traditional listing might. So for risk averse or lower cash buyers, the auction may be an impossibility. And so when I'm reviewing comparables with my sales and with my sellers, if I'm seeing a lot of FHA, VA, USDA loans, if I'm seeing a lot of concessions, those types of things are indicative to me of, slightly more risk averse buyers, and in some cases, less cash oriented buyers. And so if that's a product that's in really good shape, my advice to those sellers is go with a traditional listing. If on the other hand, within that same neighborhood and some of those same financing parameters, it's a house that needs a lot of work, that typically makes it a somewhat target-rich environment for fix and flip investors. For the exact same reason that those home buyers may not participate at the auction or may not have the cash for both the acquisition and the renovation, they typically are willing to pay somewhat of a premium for a turnkey property, being that they can finance a large portion of that. So, again, a lot of it is in the analysis, at the outset, and just making sure that both the product type and the seller situation makes sense for it. I think you had indicated, in the early going that auctioneers say that they can get 125% of, retail price at auction. That really, really depends on what it is. And I think part of that has to do with most likely pricing. And what I mean by that is that traditional listing agents have a tendency to price properties for the most likely buyers. And so at that level, you're kind of setting a ceiling on what people may pay. That's obviously not been the case over the last 6 or 12 months, where buyers are very regularly competitively bidding on traditional listings and the price may bump up. But in a neutral market, a slightly cooler market, then that very infrequently happens. You would expect an offer at list price or below, whereas an auction doesn't have a ceiling. The buyers are going to push the price exactly where they feel it should go. Again, whether that makes sense to me or you or the other buyers is inconsequential, so long as they have the wherewithal to buy it and they close on it.
Yeah.
Winning the contract is one thing, settling is something very slightly different.
Yeah, and we're going to get into that because I know some of these online auctions, I mean, a lot of people back out. I know people that have backed out on these online auctions, and then there's a premium that they have to pay for doing that, as a penalty. So can you kind of take us through the different types of auctions? I mean, obviously, foreclosure auctions, one of them, right?
Yeah, so you have, basically 3 types of auctions in my mind. You have foreclosures, and those to me correlate with pretty much any court-ordered auction. And in the vast majority of cases, court-ordered auctions are ones that are going to be held either at the courthouse, on site at the property, and they're almost always live auctions. I haven't really seen an instance where a foreclosure is done online. We have done some court-ordered sales, but they're not necessarily mandated to be auctioned. We have done those online, but the preponderance would be, on-site live auctions. Then you have any type of owner sale. A voluntary auction is another way that it's sometimes referred to, but that's you as the property owner are choosing the auction as a methodology to sell the property. And so, that'll have some facets that are similar to a traditional listing as far as what materials are provided to the buyers, the availability of showings, what, pre-auction offers are a part of that very often, especially again in this kind of market. And then the third type are what you're seeing with some of the national providers like Hubzu or auction.com or the equivalent, that, most of the time those are bank-owned properties. They may be titled as foreclosures. In the vast majority of cases, they're actually post-foreclosure. They've already gone through the foreclosure process. The bank owns them. And so the way that their process works can be a little bit different. Having worked with some of those sellers, the banks themselves, a lot of times they have a very formulaic process, which is, they price by committee. It might be 2 or 3 different broker price opinions. They may have an internal review committee, and they put the property out there at auction. If it doesn't hit that price, then they don't sell it and they reevaluate it. So it's not uncommon to see a property 2 and 3 times until it's priced appropriately. In the kind of market that we've had for the last 6 or 12 months, I think that probably happened a little less often. But if you were looking at 2016, 17, 18, as some of these companies were ramping up, a lot of the stuff didn't trade the first time around, and then it came back around, a second or third time, and it eventually moved. So, all 3 of those have different seller interests, seller pricing parameters, what information may be available, the terms of sale, choosing title companies. So each one can be a little bit different. It's just the offer process that has the title auction on it that links them together.
So what do you guys do mostly? I mean, do you get involved in a lot of the foreclosure auctions for the banks?
We're not a high volume foreclosure provider anymore. Our feeling as a company was to work with local banks, regional banks, private lenders, those types of community-based lenders, credit unions. And honestly, through consolidation, there are less of them around. And so you have a lot more very large regional banks, which we still have some as clients. And then you have big national providers like Bank of America or Wells Fargo, or the equivalent. And so those very largest banks have a preference on pricing. They have a very strict model. And, our goal as an auctioneer is to get these properties out to third-party purchasers. That is, you as the buyers, we want to get it out to you. We don't want to run a wash foreclosure that puts it back into that REO portfolio. But, what goes along with that is that we charge a little bit more, because we feel we're doing more marketing to achieve that end goal for the bank, which then, eliminates the necessity for them to pay additional brokerage fees when they ultimately relist it, and, take title and holding costs by having that from other times. So the bulk of our business really is owner sales. These are voluntary sales. Some of them will be estates. Some of them will be guardianships. A lot of them are just individual homeowners, investors. Some of our clients are folks who get these properties from the courthouse foreclosures, take title to them, clean them up, and bring them back to us. Because again, we're doing a more robust job marketing the properties, and we can get something that is more reflective of the market by doing that, rather than the sight unseen courthouse foreclosure. Our other court ordered and court related stuff, we're doing a lot of stuff with Baltimore City right now. Part of that is the city receivership program for their residential properties. I think anybody who knows about Baltimore knows that there are a good number of vacant properties there.
Yeah.
And so one of the methodologies that the city is using to get these properties back into useful hands, better condition, back on the tax rolls, and, with people occupying them, is through the vacant house program, which involves, when these properties get a vacant house notice on them and it's not resolved, eventually it'll work its way through a receivership process, and the receivers tend to prefer to sell them at auction because it provides more transparency for the people related to the court matter, more transparency to the buyers and to the court itself. So
Yeah.
we're doing a little bit of everything, but I would say, again, predominantly voluntary owner sales, whether that's for attorneys, other real estate brokers who we work with, or the individual owners themselves.
So when people come to you to sell at auction, do they have to prepay marketing expenses?
Sometimes. This is a model that's been shifting since I've been working, and so that's about 15 years. That when I started, the marketing budgets were greater and they were much more often prepaid. And part of that was we were doing a lot more print advertising, so newspapers, more postcard flyers. With digital marketing being what it is, there are certainly cost-effective parameters that go with that. So for us as a company, we typically are separating out what our fee is and what the marketing budget is. If a property doesn't sell, then that marketing budget would typically be applicable. On the other hand, depending on the product, depending on the situation, we may be willing to roll that marketing into our fee the same way that a lot of traditional listing agents might. So, there are a bunch of savings that are attributable to the auction for the sellers. the apportionment of the recordation and transfer taxes, who's paying title costs. There's sometimes contract interest, which runs from the date of sale forward. And so all those bring down the overall cost for sellers versus a traditional listing, but it still bears the question as to whether the auction will achieve the best net price for the seller. It's one thing to rejigger some of the small items, but the big picture is what price can you achieve and can you generate qualified buyers who are going to close?
Yeah, right. So we've got a comment which is going to lead us right into being prepared for an auction, and I can tell you that as a real estate broker and working with investors a lot through the years and being an investor myself, we have really seen a trend where a lot of the buyers are less prepared now than they've ever been, especially since the pressure is so hot for buying something. And everybody wants to jump on the buy bandwagon so they can produce this, rehabbed inventory to take advantage of the sell bandwagon that's going or has been going on with the real estate being so hot that I've seen so many people make big, costly mistakes by buying property that they're not being prepared for. And they're not knowing the area. They're not going inside. They're buying on sight unseen and by picture and Google imaging, which a lot of times changes, right? So, I mean, you check out something that they haven't updated, and then you go there and you realize that the house you thought was next door is really not there anymore. But Robert from LinkedIn, Robert, we appreciate you commenting. And I don't know what you are, but it seems like you may be a real estate professional. If you're a buyer and new to auctions, an informed and experienced real estate professional representing you is invaluable. I 100% agree. Thank you, Robert, for that comment. And, I can't say enough. I mean, you can have an agent register representing you at an auction. And I highly recommend that as well, because, a good qualified agent is going to do certain things like run comps for you and get you information that directly pertains to your ability to make a profit, hopefully make a profit when it comes time to selling. But Charles, just kind of go through some of the, steps that you recommend, that, and you said some of these things. So kind of take us down the path. So most buyers are paying cash, right? I mean, they're ultimately or hard money or some kind of financing, especially if it's a distressed sale. I mean, you're not looking for somebody at the end of the day to do a rehab loan, or are you?
I'm not looking for it necessarily, but it happens. We try to speak to the buyers as much as we can in advance of the auction to walk them through some of these, matters, whether you want to call them concerns or pitfalls or opportunities, it depends on the situation. But, when I started working, buyers had a tendency to be more cash heavy. I think the real estate market in general has shifted. So I don't think this is something that's isolated to auctions, that there is a higher reliance on financing, and not just on residential product, but also on commercial product, that, people are looking for cash on cash analyses rather than, a total cap rate. So if they can make the deal work with just their down payment, they can get at least, then that's fine. Then that's part of the analysis. But, speaking directly to, Robert's question, Robert's point, and how that relates back to preparedness, what he said about informed and experienced is important. I think there is a tendency in the brokerage community for some of the most junior agents to be representing buyers. And so that is how they get their foothold in the business. I certainly don't begrudge them that, but in a lot of cases, they really don't have the experience or wherewithal to provide, good advice. So I think that's really the first responsibility for the buyer, is that if you are relying on professional advice, and I think that you should, that includes, real estate professionals, that includes contractors, that includes, your financing professional and your title company, you got to interview. As with real estate agents or attorneys or plumbers or dentists, not all of them are equally as good as one another. And so if you're looking at a particular product type, which may be residential properties that need renovation in Howard County, how many properties has this person sold in Howard County? Were they all already in good shape, or did a lot of them need work? Do they have good contacts with, tradesmen and other professionals? And I know that realtors and brokers have shied away from providing those recommendations. I'm not immune to that either. I have a tendency not to provide recommendations for contractors just because, it's a hard outfit. Communication skills are mixed. And so, for me, I want people to utilize what tools are out there, whether that's something like Angie's List, whether that's relying on your friends and family and coworkers to give you feedback on other people that they've used in the past. Again, interview the professionals that you're using, make sure you're using the right person. And then in general, as far as buyer preparedness, there's a lot of information available digital. This has changed the real estate market a lot in general, but there's a lot of research that you may be able to do yourself, that may be using jurisdictional GIS websites, which will give you an opportunity to look at zoning. It will give you an opportunity in some cases to look at contour maps. So if you're looking at a piece of land and you're looking to see if there's a building envelope, you may be able to look at a contour map yourself and see that it is a cliffside. It may not have showed up on the satellite on Google, although Google has some contour maps now too. It may not have been apparent when you looked at it because the lot was very wooded, but if you use those types of tools, you're going to get a better feel on the property from there. One of the tools that I find to be of mixed success are the syndicated websites. So Zillow, Trulia, and I know one or both of them are launching brokerage now, Realtor.com. I find that buyers rely on pricing models from these types of syndicated websites that are predominantly reflecting product that has been listed and sold traditionally. And as a general rule, the product that is being listed and sold traditionally has a tendency to be in better shape than average. A lot of properties that need plenty of work may have been sold at foreclosure and they were never on the MLS, and they may not be quantitatively evaluated with the tax transfers. You may have non-arm's length transactions. You could have, estate sales again that weren't listed. They were just done, for sale by owner. So a lot of that data tends towards the better quality of the product. And so when you're looking at pricing for that, it could be fine for something that's in the top 50% of condition, but that pricing may not be applicable for the product that's in the bottom 50% of condition. And so if you're seeing, Zillow says the property's worth $250 and, the retail prices of newly renovated product are $300 and the house needs $100, no, you shouldn't pay $250. You should pay something slightly less than $200 to allow yourself some breathing room, have enough money for closing costs and everything else, so that you're ultimately into the property for $300 as a home buyer. If you're an investor, then you probably don't want to pay more than $160, so that all in you have a net result of maybe 35 grand after fees and everything else, and you can probably do the renovation for a little less than the owner occupant would.
So when we're talking about, having professional advice and, a lot of times people are going to these auctions and they don't have real estate agents. So your fiduciary is to the seller, right?
Yeah, we represent the seller in the same way that you as a traditional broker would represent the seller.
Right.
For me, I'm also an associate broker. So, my obligations for owner sales align with that to a certain degree. There are exceptions for the auction itself, but if somebody were to make an offer in advance of the auction, that puts me in the same general responsibility as you would have. And in all those cases, we have, the list of responsibilities to the sellers, confidentiality.
But as far as people reaching out to you and saying, hey, Chuck, can you help me out with this, or give me the ins and outs, or tell me this and that? I mean, really, when you're representing the seller in that, you can't really give them professional opinions and advice.
You can give them information, so for us, we're really trying to package that information and put it on the website, put it in the listing, put it out there for everybody to find. That's not only, that a property is zoned BL, that is also, here's the zoning link for Baltimore County.
Right.
That you can then go find out what permitted use there are within a BL zone. And so, we're providing information. Is there an ability for us to provide guidance to buyers without breaching, our fiduciary responsibility to the seller? Yeah,
Yeah.
there is. If somebody comes to me and they're saying, I want to pay $100,000 for a property that I know is worth $225,000, and we've had offers at, 175 and 200 already, my guidance for that buyer is going to be, I think your time is probably better spent elsewhere.
Yeah.
I hope you choose to participate. Don't get me wrong. We're happy to have you, but the likelihood of you getting this property is low.
Right.
And so, that is an efficiency metric that we don't want buyers wasting time on things that they may not ultimately buy. There's a ton of, gray area. We don't know where buyers' pricing is all the time. So we really focus on providing the best caliber of information that we can. A lot of times that's easier with owner sales than it will be with a foreclosure. With a foreclosure, a lot of times we're just being provided, an address or a tax ID, and we derive what information we can, from the public records. And in
You
some
don't want
cases,
to give too much information on that, right? I mean, that's kind
well,
of one of those.
I don't think that's the case. I mean, we as salespeople and, an information source for our clients and buyers, want to provide the best information we can. For a trustee or a substitute trustee, there's a correlating liability that goes along with each additional piece of information that you provide. So have there been instances where we've derived the zoning and the trustee says, you can't guarantee that? And we say, you're right, we can't guarantee that. And so, it'll be struck from the marketing. But with owner sales, again, they may have surveys, they may have well tests, they may have septic tests, an environmental report, whatever's applicable for the product type. We want to get that information to the buyers, even if we're not doing the pricing specifically for them.
And I think one of the things that you need to be aware as a buyer going to an auction, I mean, if it is a foreclosure auction, a lot of times, I mean, these are done at courthouse steps, depending on, what county and I guess state, or there's different requirements and laws. But a lot of times these places are occupied. I mean, there may be a tenant inside, or there may be the owner inside. So they are foreclosing. I mean, you can't go inside, it's unlawful. And a lot of the sites will say, you cannot go on the premises, it's unlawful to do so. Don't disturb the tenants. So this becomes something that it's your responsibility then to evict them. And so, one of the biggest things that, Charles, I've been to a lot of your, auctions. Most of them you can go through an auction day and even get in, ahead of time, with making an appointment. But a lot of times, I mean, the biggest mistake I see people making is buying these things without going inside, because unless the numbers are really super cheap, you have a lot at risk. I mean, there could be foundational issues, things that you can't see until you get inside. And these are big ticket, items. So let's kind of talk about auction day. So you have to be prepared for when you're coming to an auction. If you have never been to an auction before and you're interested in buying an auction, the best thing I could say is go visit them, get a kind of a feel of what's going on. But when you want to become a bidder, in some cases, and you can kind of give us an update on the way things are happening now, because COVID really changed a lot of the way things are being auctioned. Simulcast, where you have some of that was kind of going on. I feel before COVID, it was kind of like the start of it, where you could bid online or be live. And then you have that straight, like you said, online auction. But you need to pony up some cash when you're going to plan on bidding. So, Chuck, you want to go ahead and talk about that? And people have to get bank checks or send in their credit card information?
Yeah, each auctioneer has, a slightly different process. Across the board, especially with courthouse foreclosures, there's typically going to be, a cashier's check, a bank check requirement. So that's, funds that are pulled out of the account, they're verified. You used to have, some stamped bank checks. Those don't really exist anymore. So they're predominantly, the cashier's checks. In some cases, you'll be required to bring that up to 10%. That's the case for most of our auctions. So they may say, a $10,000 cashier's check is required, deposit to be increased to 10% within 24 hours. So you'll want to make sure that not only do you have that cashier's check, but you have the additional cash behind it to come up to 10%. You don't want to be in a bind where you're trying to transfer money from, a money market account that takes 72 hours. You want those funds liquid. That goes along with the closing process too, that if you are paying in cash and you got a closing date coming up, then start moving your money. I don't think that's any different than a traditional sale. But, getting to your point about what additional funds may be required, with the transaction, either at the outset with the deposit or further down the line with the closing, really depends on the type of sale, and I think starting with the terms of sale that are advertised are what you really want to start with. And so anytime you have a property advertised for auction, there will be terms of sale available. For foreclosures, they're marketing them in newspapers for, usually 3 weeks leading up to the auction, at least jurisdictionally in Maryland, that's the case. And so those will have the full terms of sale. That'll tell you what type of title you may be getting. Those will tell you what types of closing costs you may be responsible for, or trustees' fees, or contract interest. It may also tell you if the property is being sold subject to anything else or not. So it's not uncommon to have foreclosures on a second mortgage, and you would be buying it subject to the first mortgage, which in the vast majority of cases is going to need to be paid off at closing. So you may only pay $100,000 for a property that's worth $400,000, but there's a $250,000 mortgage in first position. And so you're going to have to come up with the rest of that money when you close on it. So your true purchase price is $350,000 on that $400,000 plus whatever applicable closing costs that you have. And so reviewing the terms and knowing for sure what type of additional expenses you may have is important. For most of our sales,
buyer premiums too. I mean, you got to make sure that there isn't a buyer premium, because the hammer goes down and there's a buyer premium on it, 5%. I mean, that changes the game.
Yeah, so most of our auctions don't have a buyer's premium, and I would think most foreclosure auctions also don't have a buyer's premium. Buyer's premium is typically applicable on owner sales, and it'll say it almost always very apparently in the terms. They'd always say it.
Online auctions.
Yeah, I mean, when you sign up for an online auction, you're typically agreeing to those terms, when you register. And I know all of us have this affect that when we're signing up for a new account, whether it's a streaming provider or, a shopping site or an auction site, you're agreeing to a whole collection of terms. Do yourself a favor and read those terms. That's
and
something that people skip over very often, and you're agreeing to responsibilities.
I've bought online, and something that if you've never bought online before or haven't experienced it, and it says it right in there, there's a disclosure on most of the sites where the app can bid against you until the reserve is met. So a lot of times, you're thinking, you're getting bid on, and the price is going up incrementally, and it's actually the computer that is bidding against you, their app, to get your price up to, the reserve. So let's kind of talk about, I always find it very interesting. When I go locally here in Maryland to the auctions, a lot of times I see the same players, right? You see the same guys show up, and maybe they have sunglasses on or hats or whatever. Maybe they want their presence to be known. Maybe they don't. They might be more friendly, coming up and shaking your hand, and kind of you guys kind of conversing back and forth like, hey, what's going on? Or talk about a different auction. And you get that going on. And then you have just kind of like the neighbors that start coming in, and everybody's curious to see what it's going to sell for. When you're showing up, especially as a beginner, and, and Anthony, we appreciate you watching. We just had a comment from him on LinkedIn talking about, this being very informative for a novice consumer. We really appreciate you watching. And any other questions, guys, just go ahead and comment them in. We'd love to answer them for you. And if you're watching after the live show, go ahead and comment drop us a comment. We will be monitoring that, and we'll still get you the answers you're looking for. You know, how do you navigate the players, Chuck, at the auction? You're a novice, you're just kind of starting here. You're taking it all in. You're walking through the house. Sometimes you may feel a little bit intimidated. What kind of, how do you look at the crowd and just kind of, take that all in?
Yeah, so you talked about a couple of different subjects. One of them is the computer algorithm or the system bidding against you, and that's something that should be in the terms in all cases if the auctioneer or seller reserve the right to bid on behalf of the reserve, on behalf of the minimum. And so that will indicate to you as the buyer that it may not be all third-party buyers bidding against you. That's not a strategy that we utilize. But it is a strategy that's very common in the auction field. That's as compared with a foreclosure auction where the lender is a bidder like anybody else. At least in Maryland, that's the case where, the lender, in some cases, especially with big banks and at courthouse sales, they may open it at the full statement of debt, which is all the lender is entitled to. And if anybody bids over that amount, then the lender's out. In other cases, they'll start at a number that's lower than that. And even if there's only one guy standing there and he says, who is bidding against me? The answer is the lender. The auctioneer's either been given instructions as to what amount will be acceptable for the lender, or they'll take it as far as that they think they can go with that third party buyer. And then they'll have a consultation with the lender, the representative, trustee, who's ever there on site and say, hey, do you want to cut it loose or not? And so, those are two different things. But again, things for buyers to be informed about so they know who they're bidding against. Should it really matter? I don't know. I think if you have a number in mind and the property, the asset is worth that amount to you, it shouldn't really matter who's bidding against you. You either want the property or you don't. But I certainly have spoken with a number of buyers who don't like that facet of the business, that, when the lender's bidding against them or they think the auctioneer, is bidding against them on behalf of the seller, it can leave a bad taste. My best advice for that is read the terms. It gets back to exactly what I talked about. Be informed. If you want to call the auctioneer and ask them, some will give you the answer, some won't. But, I would suspect the vast majority of them are going to tell you exactly what it is. They don't want anybody to be surprised. And, especially if it's a shop that's been in business for a long time, they have a reputation to maintain, and we certainly feel that way. As far as getting used to the personalities around the auctions, I can appreciate how that can be intimidating. When I got started, there was a lot of bluster, there was a lot of ego, some degree among the auctioneers, and most of them were my family members, so I was more used to it. But among the buyers and sellers, there's a lot of things that are going on in their mind. You may have, two family members who have owned this property for multiple generations, and they're saying all the great things about the property, what they loved about it, the maple tree that's in the backyard that still has, the notches from where their swing was. Or you may have a seller that, picked it up on the fly a month ago and is flipping it back out, and is staying very mum because he really doesn't want people to know that it's his. Because for the people who are out at these auctions all the time, they know that he's an investor and they know that, this is a margin circumstance. And for whatever reason, that changes their perspective on what they want to pay. The best advice I can give is not to listen to what the other bidders are saying. Their incentive is their own. There may be an earnest willingness to help you, but it's really hard to weed through in that context. And so if it's somebody who really seems like they're trying to be helpful, maybe don't take their advice that day. Maybe schedule a coffee or a lunch with them to, get their feelings about the real estate investment market, what they're seeing, and take that advice. But, very often when somebody is shouting very loudly in a house prior to the auction that it's in the worst shape you ever saw, it's going to fall down tomorrow, and suddenly they start bidding, you can be pretty well sure that, they may not have been totally genuine about their concern on those issues. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. So, should somebody, what's kind of like the strategy that if you had to get outside of your, representing a seller. And by the way, I mean, now we can kind of ask you these questions because, we can't do it on auction day. We can't say, hey, Chuck, man, tell us how to win this house. I mean,
Whatever you want on auction day.
What's that?
You can ask me whatever you want on auction day.
Yeah, I know. But, so if you had to, you're talking to your kid or you're talking to your buddy, your brother or whatever, and you're saying, hey, these are some of the things you want to do when you go to an auction, give us some of those pointers. So, is a strategy to just jump up to the price that you want to pay or off the, start? Do you kick back and kind of, let everybody go? What should somebody do?
Number one, there's a lot of materials to read on the subject matter. I think there were 2 Nobel Prizes in the last year on auction theory, and part of that is applicable to auctions across the board. Part of it is applicable to auction as a statistical model. But you can look into some of those materials, and auctions being one of the oldest professions around, there is a pretty good amount of literature on what may work best for you and in what circumstances. So, there's a lot of guidance on prospectively waiting until the end. Philosophically, if you are bidding in the early going, you could look at that as bidding against yourself. That, you're boosting the price artificially in the early going, whereas if you hang back, wait for the other bidders to do that to themselves, then you can find out if it's going to be at a price that works for you. And especially if you're a very regular investor, you may or may not want to tip your hand. Some people don't want other folks to know what they're willing to pay for product, and they try to keep their cards close to the chest. In other cases, they may come out hot and heavy because those other investors are seeing this as somebody who wants to pay strong prices for a property, and so maybe they start sourcing them deals directly. It's not uncommon for wholesalers and other types of real estate investors to just be at auction, presumably to shop their own wares. There may be some pretense that maybe they're a bidder, maybe they're not. And we have, kind of a fun cat and mouse game with them that to a certain degree, they're leveraging off of the marketing that we will have spent, that the seller will have spent to produce this crowd. And they're there then shopping to their crowd too. So, my feeling is at least wait until the auction's over to start showing people your hot sheets with what you have available. But for bidding strategy specifically, again, it depends on what your perspective is. If you're bidding on 100 auctions a month, you're going to have a different strategy than that home buyer who's looking for that one perfect house in the neighborhood that they've been looking in for 5 or 6 years. And so if you're in that latter category, again, do your homework, figure out what price works for you, and then you can be a little bit fun with the bidding. I think there's a tendency for people to bid the lowest possible increment in an effort to try and save themselves money. But that's true for the other bidders as well, that they're going to follow along with you if you're only bidding in $1,000 increments. Whereas, again, if you're talking about a $300,000 asset and the starting bid is $150,000, maybe you go straight to $225 or $250. That ideally you're going to scare off those other people. And that was my experience, with bidding on a few properties. But that's going to chase some of them away. Or even if you're closer to the end and somebody else is bidding $1,000, you jump them by 5 each time, they're going to have to think harder about that next bid than if you only go by $1,000. The difference between 281 and 283 is nothing, but the difference between 281 and 286 is more significant in their mind. So again, it's really situation dependent, what the type of product is and what the buyer's overall viewpoint on what it may be. There's also a huge difference in auctions based on the real estate market in general. And so, Todd, for you, having been to auctions over the last 12 months or 18 months, may have seen a lot of prices that appeared to you to be out of bounds. Some of them, I'm sure, were totally out of bounds and there wasn't money to be made, or they had already lost money by the time they had closed, if they try and go and resell this thing not long thereafter. But, as the market levels, as the market gets cooler, I think it's to a certain degree a kiss a lot of frogs proposition, where if you go to a lot of auctions, you are going to find some deals. There are some properties that just kind of slide under the radar. They didn't get the attention that they should have. We try to make sure that never happens. We try to do a really great job marketing so that we do have a very regular and consistent buyer pool, as well as new buyers who may be willing to pay a little bit more money. So, a certain portion of our marketing is geared towards securing that floor. Your most regular buyers who are definitely going to pay, something that is a reasonable price, and then attracting the new buyers who may be willing to pay more as an owner occupant, or maybe as somebody who's just getting into it, may be okay with a slightly skinnier margin while they get their feet underneath of that.
Yeah, I found for the last several years, it seems like auction pricing has just been over the top and too much for me. Um, and I guess it just depends on your strategy. If your strategy is to flip or if your strategy is to buy and hold. I mean, certainly if your strategy is to buy and hold and it's something that makes sense for you as a long-term, play as far as a rental or something like that, you're going to be able to pay more than if it's a rehab. And for example, a lot of times there really may not be anything wrong with the house other than it's never been touched in 40 years. So the kitchen is 40 years old and you're dealing with, turquoise countertops or pink tile in bathrooms and green tile in bathrooms. And guess what? As a rental in certain areas, that may not matter. You may still be able to get decent rents for it. You don't have to rip that bathroom out. So, but if you're looking at it from a rehab standpoint, which most of what I've done through the years has been flipping because I have a construction company. So that's what I'm looking for. I'm looking to be able to build work into, my strategy and, to profit from that. And then obviously for me as a broker or a licensee to be able to get some upside with some commission. So, when I'm looking at it, it's a little bit different than a lot of people, but I'm seeing where a lot of the people that are going to the auctions are actually people that do the work, especially if they're looking to rehab. So they're not going to contract it out to somebody. So they're going through the place themselves. They're saying, okay, yeah, I have to redo this, redo that. A foundation crack, excuse me, I have to take care of that. So, but to answer your comment about the last year, I've seen it over the last several years. It used to be that you could say, hey, it's raining, it's going to be a great auction day. That's not the case anymore, man. People are out there getting soaking wet, umbrellas, they're stepping through puddles and mud you're smiling. You know what I'm saying? I mean, we used to be like, yes, it's raining today,
I
people
do.
aren't going to show up.
It wasn't the case with a properly marketed auction. I would have
Okay.
buyers say that to me very regularly. And
Yeah.
based on what we were doing, we would often have bigger buyer pools on rainy days for exactly the same philosophy that you're talking about. Some of the most regular buyers are like, I
The
bet other
serious
people
ones
aren't
come
going to
out.
come out today.
Yeah.
And they do. So, I mean, it really depends on the product. If you're talking about something that's readily available. So if you have a $50,000 townhouse in Baltimore City, that there are 50,000 other properties that are exactly like that, and they're very regularly available, then the weather or somebody's kid being sick or the tire blowing on their car is going to be enough to get them not to come to the auction. If you have something that's $500,000 on the water that isn't available ever, then they're going to do whatever they have to do to get there. And I've certainly had my fair share of auctions in driving rain and sleet and, sub-zero temperatures and 100-degree temperatures. And
I like to see you guys out there with the wind blowing and the rain.
Yeah.
And, I mean, it makes me feel like you're really working hard for your money. You know what I mean?
I think the running wisdom there is that there's no such thing as bad weather, only bad clothing. So
That's right.
I certainly have plenty of Under Armour gear. Nice plug for a Baltimore company. But, cold weather, I'm geared up from the inside out. Lots of raincoats, good boots. Good boots are important. But yeah, we're the mailman of real estate. We're out there in all degrees.
Well, some people say the best time to look at real estate's in the rain because you can see if the basement's leaking.
I love selling vacant houses in the rain. The buyers know exactly what's broken right off the bat. I love it. Nobody gets surprised by, a secret leak in a corner. It's coming right out.
Exactly. So talk about some of the pitfalls. So, liens. Is everybody kind of guaranteeing that the title will be clear and insurable with a title policy before they close?
I don't know that everybody is. There are instances where, the seller, whether it's a creditor or, a trustee, whatever the case may be, that they're selling their right title and interest. So if you have, a sheriff sale that's being sold on a judgment, the property owners might be two, and the judgment's only against one. So effectively, you're selling a half interest in the property. That's kind of a rare anecdotal circumstance, but what is being conveyed is the right title and interest in the property. And so with court-ordered sales, it gets back to what we were talking about before. In reviewing the terms, they're going to tell you what is being conveyed to a certain degree. If it lacks clarity, then try to get clarity from the auctioneer or a real estate attorney or somebody who's in the know. If ultimately you aren't clear on what is being conveyed, do not participate. Don't presume that it's going to work out fine, because we're not talking about, a t-shirt acquisition or a hamburger acquisition. We're talking about, 5, 6, 7-figure acquisitions, and sometimes more, that you want to have some degree of certainty. For our sales, the vast majority of them, including the court-ordered stuff, we're guaranteeing free and clear, good, marketable title. The trustees for the lenders, especially the types of lenders that we're working for, have the ability to verify what liens are out there. It's not any different than a title company being able to do it. And so they'll be able to find what back taxes may be due, if there's a priority lien, what the case may be. And so when they're proceeding with the sale, they're basically saying to the buyers, we are going to pay off those items. We're giving you free and clear, good, marketable title. There are some circumstances with some gray area on the insurability of title, because title insurance providers aren't all the same. As with the dentists and the attorneys and the contractors, not every business operates exactly the same way. And so the example that I would use for that is that properties that are acquired via tax lien are going to have a tax sale deed. You're getting it from the finance department or the mayor or whatever the jurisdiction is that's signing the deed, but that can be viewed as a break in the chain of title. And so some title insurance underwriters won't deal with tax lien properties. And so it gets back to figuring out who you're going to use for title work, developing a relationship there, and they may be able to do some of that research for you before you go to the auction.
Yeah.
And so they'll be able to do an abstract or get a title report and figure out what may be sitting there. And if ultimately they're going to do the closing anyway, then maybe that expedites your closing process as well. So, look at the terms, look at what you may be responsible for, in addition to what you're going to be doing to the asset itself. I think the details that typically get lost in the mix for buyers, especially new investors, are that A, they're going to have front side closing costs. B, when they go to resell it, they're going to have backside closing costs and commissions and potentially concessions. And so they do a more simplified math on the acquisition that isn't quite right. If it's worth 300 when I'm done and I'm going to have to put 100 into it, then I can afford to pay 175 because I want to make a $25,000 profit. That's going to be not the case. You're going to eat that $25,000 in just the closing costs front and back. And so there's going to be nothing left over for you there. So, factoring in all those items, are something that
good representation. Yeah, that's
good representation, good experienced people who have been through these transactions before, so that they know what they know. The problem again with some brand new agents who just don't have the years, they don't have the transactions, is they don't know what they don't know. And so they're giving people guidance based on comparable sales and based on estimates, and they're totally missing massive considerations that should be undertaken. So again, interview your people well, get as much information as you can, get the terms, make sure your cash is there, and be prepared for the auction day.
Yeah, I can't agree with you more. I mean, certainly if you are looking to participate in auctions and you're kind of new to it, you certainly want to make sure that you have an agent, in my opinion, that is representing you. And you do need to ask the questions, because there are a lot of great agents out there, but they just have no experience dealing with investors. So, having somebody asking them, how many investors do you, serve, and, how many rehabs have you participated in as far as, helping them flip them or rent them. And a lot of times these agents that work with investors, they even know what some of the costs are. And I know you had mentioned earlier, being hesitant to giving good contractor referrals, people that actually do the work. It is scary, giving referrals, because it's kind of like your name. You're recommending somebody. But I find, from being in the industry for 30 plus years of rehabbing, I have a lot of good, solid, references to give out. And, just about in any trade. So if you guys, locally here, if you need somebody, I'd be happy to point you in the right direction. Let's talk about, before we wrap up here, what percentage of, now there's a lot going on in the real estate market right now. And if you listen to the headline news, people are saying things like, it's all propaganda, in my opinion. We're talked in and out of recessions. I don't think there is such a thing. We just, the hysteria and the hype of it creates it. But we are starting to see articles where people are saying, headline news, that the real estate market's cooling off. The buyers have tapped out. They're tired of overpaying, and things like that. And in 2005, I remember when I was doing a lot of rehab work and building in 2005, before the big recession, a crash of 2008, as we know it, the headlines of the Baltimore Sun came out, the overpriced Baltimore housing market, and it was like, boom, instantly we started seeing things pull back. So, what we're seeing on the traditional brokerage side of things is that we are seeing some buyer remorse, and we're seeing where, there's a cooling off period kind of between, saying, I'll take it, giving your deposit, and then going through maybe an as-is inspection process where you have a right to terminate. And we're starting to see where some of this inventory now that was under contract is coming back on the market. And so what percentage of that do you see on the auction side? Do you see a buyer's remorse on the auction side? And kind of take us through that.
Yeah, so to your point about how the market transitions, we're really at ground level. As a company that's doing enough transactions of a different variety very regularly, we're seeing buyer responses, that adjust. And so for us, the price may be exactly the same as it was 6 months ago. And in some cases, they're down a little bit, but the price may be exactly the same. Whereas 6 months ago, maybe I had 30 or 40 registered bidders for a property, and now I have 20. So from a statistical standpoint, if you're just looking at the comp, it looks exactly the same. For us, we're seeing a cooling of response. Who those buyers are, going back to the most seasoned buyers, as there are more theoretical deals and in some cases actual deals to be had, along the way. And so, as far as buyer's remorse goes, yeah, we see it. It's what you said to a certain degree, that there are times that people simply get carried away, that they are in the emotion of it. They don't like that guy's face, and so they don't want him to have it. And so they keep bidding irrespective of numbers that make sense. And in some cases, we're seeing that remorse right away, the next day, 2 days later. And I had that with one, that we had last week, that the buyer didn't take enough time to look at it. He didn't evaluate the product well enough, and, called me the next day. He had already sent in his deposit, and he's like, what can we do? For us, we've moved towards a model where we are trying to do what we can to make sure that folks don't lose their deposit. That is your risk as a buyer. Number one is a loss of deposit. That's going to be applicable in almost every case. That's a hard deposit right away that'll be taken as liquidated damages if you don't proceed. There may be other considerations, which is a risk and resale provision. So in Maryland, at foreclosure sale, it's one or the other. That, the lender, the trustee are given two options. It's either liquidated damages or reselling the property at the risk and expense of the defaulting purchaser. So if the property sells for $50,000 less the next time and they exercise the risk and resale provision, then they could sue you for 50 grand, even though your deposit may have only been 20. Maybe they give you the 20 back and sue you for the 50. The majority of the time, they're going to go for the cash that's there. So it's usually liquidated damages. But, with owner sales, the terms are voluntarily agreed to. These are less statutorily mandated, that as long as they don't exceed legal mandates, they're enforceable. And so for our contracts, there's both. There's liquidated damages, the lost deposit, and the seller could prospectively sue you for the difference. Do I see that happen a lot? No. I used to see it happen a little bit more, especially when we had more attorney-oriented sales. For the attorney to sue somebody isn't any great consideration. That's part of their profession.
Right.
Whereas an individual seller,
costs are right. That's right.
Yeah, an individual seller who does 2 or 3 real estate transactions in their time, is going to be less geared towards trying to default that person. But, as far as what the default rates are, as the market heats up, you tend to see more green buyers, and that's going to increase the default rate a little bit more. As the market cools off, you have a tendency to be with more seasoned buyers, more prepared buyers, people who have looked at lots of deals and decided on one. And so the likelihood of default is a little bit less. For us, I would say 6-7% default rate. And again, we've had a pretty good success percentage at getting the properties to the second bidder, whether through assignment or doing new contracts and trying to get the original purchaser most of their deposit back. Are they going to lose some money? Yeah, they're going to lose some money, but that might be $2,000 or $3,000 instead of $20,000.
Do you ever go back to the bidder that's just under the winner?
Yeah.
And offer them the contract? Does it make sense?
I just did. That was exactly the circumstance I was talking about, that we had a high bidder. He was upset with his purchase. He wasn't blaming us or the sellers, just a matter of not having done enough research. I was able to go to the second bidder. The second bidder was willing to take it at his bid. And so in that case, the original purchaser is only going to lose, $1,000 or $2,000, not
so you're
$20,000.
The second bidder offered to buy it at that higher price.
Well, the contract price, in this case, the contract price is going to show as the same, but the original purchaser is contributing $1,000 to that purchase. So, the new buyer is now going to buy it at effectively what his bid was. So the original purchaser loses $1,000. So second bidder gets it at their bid. They're bridging the gap.
Yeah.
So that is a newer way to deal with it. It's not something that we traditionally had done. But again, we're a company that wants to be around for another 103 years ideally. And so retaining buyer relationships, seller relationships is a big part of that. And again, I don't want to see somebody get burned for, an errant decision. Should they have been more prepared to purchase a $100,000, $150,000, $200,000 property? Yeah, they should have been better prepared. They're an adult. They're responsible for their own choices. And ultimately, I could have done nothing and let them lose $19,000. That's just, it's not my preference. That's not what I want to see happen. But, buyers need to be aware that that is going to be the outcome of the vast majority of defaults in an auction context, that you are certainly going to lose your deposit. There may be some other risks beyond that.
So just, real quick and closing up here, a couple things. So I'm just kind of curious as to the strategy with this. And this is sort of like a personal thing, a kind of question from me. I'm seeing where before with auctions, I could actually be the buyer and still get a real estate commission that was being offered for the purchase. And I'm seeing now that auctioneers are saying, look, if you're a licensee and you're a buyer, there are no commissions. What kind of shifted that, and kind of why?
I don't know that that's necessarily been a shift. I think that's a firm by firm consideration. I think the types of auctioneers that are out there have changed a little bit, so that you have national rate, providers a little bit more regularly now, maybe a consideration. I mean, part of that to me is that, what percentage of our investor purchasers are licensees or are tied in with a licensee, and that said licensee didn't show them the property, did not put the listing in front of them, that, you know, the investor found the listing and is like, Joe's my friend, I'm signing him up and bringing him to the auction. We're still going to pay Joe. As a company, for us, we're still going to pay Joe most of the time, but was there actually a brokerage paradigm there? And so for you as the buyer yourself, there's not really a brokerage paradigm. You're not bringing the buyer to us. I appreciate that you want that discount, and with traditional listings, that would be applicable in most cases, that if I went out and bought a house myself, was representing myself, there's a 2.5% buyer agent fee. In most cases, I'm probably not taking that fee, but I'm rolling it down off the price that I'm offering to the seller. And so, you know, that is part of the game.
At an auction.
They don't have to. You know, ultimately, it's a matter of have to versus not have to. And so if you have 18 registered buyers and you're lacking for the 19th because their broker was upset about not getting, you know, a brokerage fee, you know, if they are themselves that broker and they don't come because they're not getting that brokerage fee, then, you know, sorry, but we still have these other 18 registered bidders. And for the most part, it's very infrequent that the investor who's represented by the agent or the investor who is the agent is going to forego that deal because there isn't buyer broker participation. There are also court-ordered matters where statutorily the auctioneer can't pay buyer broker participation. So, you know, that's the case with most foreclosures and I think most court-ordered sales, that in order for there to be buyer broker participation for a foreclosure, the lender, the trustee have to be willing to pay it outside of the auditor's report, meaning they're still only entitled up to the full statement of debt, but they think they have a better shot at getting that full statement of debt if they pay a buyer agent, meaning we can list it on the MLS. And so you'll very often on the MLS see properties that are listed as foreclosures and they're not. They're REO properties. You know, there are times that we are listing properties on the MLS, and this may be true for other auctioneers nationally, that it is truly a foreclosure and the lender or the trustee are allowing us to market it on the MLS. In some cases, we'll have the availability of showing the property because the owner occupant or whomever is the title holder moved out and said, you know, instead of doing a deed in lieu, proceed with the foreclosure. And then, you know, you can have access and I'm going to be less responsible because hopefully you're going to achieve a higher price. And so there'll be less of a deficiency, meaning the shortfall that that borrower may have that they have to pay off. Again, that depends on the loans. Deficiencies, you know, starting in 2008 and 9 became less enforced because it was just bad policy for the banks. You know, they already looked like bad guys and gouging people who were losing their house at foreclosure wasn't a great look. You know, there was some tax responsibility, you know, that effectively you're getting that deficiency as income. And so I think some people who lost their houses at foreclosure got burned by the IRS on the backside too. But I think, you know, they were working on some of those laws. I don't know if how much that's shifted at this point.
So what happens in the moratorium? So here we go, right? So, you know, however many mortgages are in default, having conversations with people every day that they're waiting for their bank to tell them what they need to do. You know, they haven't made mortgage payments and sometimes in some cases over a year. And so we're kind of looking at things like what's going to happen with this inventory. You see yourself picking up a lot of this, or do you think the banks are going to work out, you know, do a workout with the borrowers?
I mean, the banks should be much more seasoned at this point. And we were talking about a decade ago, roughly, you know, a little bit more, that they went through, you know, one of the biggest batches of foreclosures that ever were. So the mechanisms that have gone into place to prevent true foreclosures, I think, are more robust, you know, whether that's an organized short sale, whether that's, you know, a deed in lieu, whether that's adjusted payments, deferred payments, whatever the case may be. I think there are a lot more tools at the behest of the banks and the borrowers to utilize.
It's a lot easier for them to foreclose, right? They're not going to go through some of the things that they went through before. I mean, they did learn some things.
Yeah, most of the provisions, at least in Maryland, are the same. And so some of these considerations are very different in Maryland than they would be nationally. So when we had the last batch, 2008, places like Nevada and Florida fell off a cliff. Their foreclosure paradigms were faster. They didn't have the moratoriums that were in place. And so immediately as the market tanked and people, lost their jobs, they missed a few payments, and suddenly 2 and 3 months later there's a glut of foreclosures on the market. In Maryland that wasn't the case, partly because the foreclosure process for residential owner occupied takes a really long time. You're talking about 9 months or a year for that. And if there's a moratorium in place, then somebody who lost their job at the beginning of COVID, there's been a moratorium in place since then. And whether or not the bank has started the foreclosure process in the meantime, some of these foreclosures might not be coming out for another year. And so that is what happened in Maryland, in the last batch, is that we were seeing a downward trending market instead of it happening all in one glut in a 6 month period of time. It basically happened over a 3 or 4 year period of time that, from 2008 through really 2011, in my view, you were seeing a downward trending market, and it probably bottomed out in 2011 and 12. And since then, we've had pretty much a steady, 9 year rise on values, a bit of a spike in the last 2 years, maybe three, in spite of, again, whatever percentage of Americans continue to be out of work. So you can't have people that are out of work not paying their mortgage or not paying their rent, which I think is an under-discussed topic, that, landlords are portrayed as, these big corporate behemoths. And you, Todd, know as well as I do that the largest volume of investors who rent properties have 2, 3, 5, 10 properties.
Yeah.
And so if their tenants stop paying, then they're in a position where their properties are going to get lost to foreclosure. And, that may be a house of cards that goes down. And so, when there are, protests that stop the rent, and you have, a huge corporate behemoth with good cash reserves, they may be able to sustain people not paying their rent for a period of time. But, Joe Investor, who's got the house he grew up in and 2 others that he bought, and his tenants stop paying, then, his livelihood and his, personal residence itself may become in jeopardy because, people could not pay their rent or chose not to pay their rent, in the face of public demand to do so, again, as painting, those landlords as villains. Are there landlords that are villains? Yes, there are. I've met lots of them. Are there landlords who do a really good job and keep clean, tight properties and are responsible to their tenants and are civically responsible people? Yeah, I've met more of them. And so, it's, again, what we would expect to see from this market moving forward are more properties available, but the coffers are largely empty. So, those REO portfolios are running very low. And so with those big banks, some of those foreclosures may go into that REO portfolio and then eventually come back out. So again, at least locally, I wouldn't expect it to come out like a waterfall. I would expect it to come out in fits and starts. And typically the markets that are most impacted by that are the lower dollar markets that have had the fastest rise. So if you have properties in Northeast Baltimore that went from 80,000 to 120,000 over the last 2 years, the perspective that they may go back to $80,000 very quickly, which is a 50% drop, is more likely than if you have something in a suburban community at $400,000, that used to be 380, and now it's only going back down to 380. So you're talking about, a 5% dip. Is it a similar gross amount of dollars? Yeah, but it's a much smaller percentage. And in most cases, those home buyers, those property owners are going to be able to sustain a 5% dip, whereas they might not be able to sustain a 50% dip. That eats out all their equity. And then, they're not able to get that property sold on the open market. So they're either locked into it or locked into a foreclosure. And so we'll see that product, by virtue of the down market too.
Yeah.
So, it's a snake eating its tail with some of the lower end products.
Well, we certainly appreciate you being on the show tonight, man. What a wealth of knowledge. And if you guys reach out to Chuck. I mean, we'll make sure that all of Chuck's information and company information is in the show notes. Guys, we hope we taught you a little bit about real estate auctions. And don't forget, if you are new to this, make sure you have good representation, good agent representation that knows the investor market. Guys, we thank you so much for watching. And until next week, Chuck, thank you so much, man.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me, Todd. Certainly hope to work with you again.
Yes, and we'll see you next time.